I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Vicki Tiase. I am very excited to introduce her, actually. Vicki Tiase is the Director of Research Science at New York Presbyterian Hospital in New York City. She is responsible for supporting a range of clinical information technology projects related to patient engagement, alarm management, and care coordination. Vicki serves on the steering committee for the Alliance of Nursing Informatics and recently completed a fellowship in the ANI Emerging Leaders Program, assessing nurse readiness to use health IT tools for patient engagement. Vicki is a long-standing member of the AMIA Nursing Informatics Working Group, serving in many different leadership roles. She completed her master's in nursing informatics at Columbia University and is currently pursuing a PhD from the University of Utah with a focus on the integration of mHealth data into clinical workflows. On a personal note, if you Google Vicki, you will learn that she is an elite triathlete, and she regularly competes in Ironman triathlons. She is also a triathlon coach, which gives her a unique perspective because she has a bird's eye view of what data athletes are collecting in their everyday lives. This, she says, helps her in her work life to make the connection and understand the potential of what we can do with this performance and health data. Please join me in welcoming Vicki Tiase.
All right, great. I got the green light. Excellent, thank you. It is a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Artie, and also thank you to Denise and to NENIC for the invitation. I'll echo the sentiments from the previous speakers. This is really an impressive group. Actually, in New York City, we've spent the last 2 years trying to amass our nursing informatics folks, and it's been really challenging. So I've been taking a lot of notes, so thank you. Okay, so to get started here. All right, so today on the topic of trends, I wanted to share with you some of my thoughts and musings on mHealth and mobile health. And mobile health is a very large topic, right? We could probably talk all day. Oops, sorry. Too loud?
No, it's in a weird spot, so it sounds strange on the recording.
Oh, okay. Better?
It's better, much better.
Excellent. Sorry about that. Thank you. So in terms of mobile health, we could think about the nurse moving around. We could think about data moving around. We could think about the patients moving around. So the viewpoint or the standpoint that I'd like to work with today is how we can incorporate the mobile health data that are out there in the world and how we can pull that into our clinical practice. So those are the pieces that I'd like to cover today. So to start, this is one of my favorites here. So we are in a mobile culture, right? So according to Pew Research, 95% of our patients have a smartphone. So that is a tremendous amount. And they're doing all sorts of interesting things with it. And in fact, most recently, I've been following a patient group. It's a ProPublica patient safety group on Facebook. And you would be amazed at the types of pictures that patients are posting. So really, it is interesting to think about the rich data that are out there and how we can potentially use them. And then here is another interesting photo. So as I was doing a little Christmas shopping over the holidays, for my niece, I was looking at different health kits. So I think, maybe there's something will work here, but hopefully you'll be able to see it. Nope. So great, we've got a female doctor, and granted this is a doctor's kit and it's pink. But what I was struck by is in the upper right-hand corner there, that is a smartphone in the doctor's kit, right? Wow, that really sends a message right there. So is that is that a tool just like the stethoscope? Maybe it is. So again, I think thinking about where we're moving with mobile and mobile data. Okay, so what is mobile health and how do you define it? I think the trick here is we hear e-health, we hear digital health, but for, again, our purposes here today, I want to take a small, microcosm there and just look at mobile health. So the official definition there from the World Health Organization, I think is a very good one. So using the mobile and wireless technologies to support health objectives. So I think that's great, and I love that piece is in the definition. Then if you move a step further, I think it's quite interesting when you look at NIH. So it talks about specifically to improve health outcomes. All right, so that I thought was really interesting when I took a look at that. Are we improving health outcomes with our mobile health data? Or is that some work that we need to do? And then taking even a step further, this I found in a variety of different definitions out there, but mobile self-care, that had me pause for a moment as well. What exactly is mobile self-care? And are we doing that? And do we know how to do that? And do we have enough evidence for that? So just some things to think about as we move forward here in talking about mobile health data. One question here for the audience. By a show of hands, how many of you, I'll just say, own or use some sort of health app on your smartphone? Oh, wow. Terrific. All right. That's probably about 90% of the room. That's quite impressive. So an interesting piece is that in terms of our population, right now it's estimated that 2% of the US population has a smartphone app dedicated to some sort of health purpose. So that's kind of interesting. I'm glad we're leading the way in this room, but what's the disconnect there, and do we need to take a look at that? So why do we care about mobile health data, and what's the importance? So I think the biggest piece is that it can contribute to patient-generated health data, right? So another way that we can capture information about the patient outside of the healthcare setting. So how can we pull that in? And I think as we heard from Anne's talk this morning, looking at creating efficiencies and reducing the burden for nursing, I think that's really a key point here with mobile health data. If we can use some of these data that patients are collecting, can that cut down on our nursing assessment? Can that cut down on the collection of some of those data? So also, again, that idea of a pivot point, how can we start to think differently about the data that we're collecting and use it for efficient nursing care? I think it can promote prevention. One of my favorite things to say is that I would love to be out of a job because everyone's healthy and we don't have to worry about the illness piece, and we can work more on the prevention and wellness piece. So I think our mobile health data and our apps have an opportunity there. Improving availability and access. So this is getting to the point of really patient ownership of data. So I think there's a bit of a paradigm shift, when we talk about interoperability, because now we're starting to think about the patient as the person that's exchanging data. And it's not the organization or the doctor that is in charge of moving the patient data around. So how can we make that shift? And I think mobile health can help with this and having the patients in control and doing that movement. Contributing to a learning healthcare system, again, how can we understand what goes on outside the four walls of the clinic or the hospital? And contributing to our decision support. So, talking about visualization and getting data to the clinicians at that point where it's needed. So how can we, in a sense, bring the data into the environment where it's being used for a particular decision, so we might not even know that it was generated by the patient. So I think these are some interesting things to think about as we embark on using mobile health data. What I wanted to do here and to talk about some of the thoughts or the points I'd like to make and share with you and to get you all thinking, I wanted to describe an example that came to me a few months back. A colleague of mine in New York City, she happens to be a physician in a local hospital, so it's actually not even in my own hospital, but she knows that I'm a runner, she knows that I'm a nurse, and she knows that I'm interested in mobile health data. And she said to me, you know what, Vicki, I had this patient come into my office recently. Also, I should mention she's an orthopedist. Patient came in with knee pain, and the patient brings in, a ream of paper and their smartphone with their password and login, and says, here, I have knee pain. I've been collecting all of these data on my app for the past 6 months. Tell me what's wrong. And she looked at him and said, I'm not so sure what to do with that. She said, let me put that aside and, I'll get back to you. So, it was enough for this physician to say, you know what are we doing with these data that are being collected and how can we use them? And so she posed a few questions to me and said, how do I know this app is okay to use? And how many apps are there that the patient could be using? Then she said, how could my whole staff, how could the whole office incorporate this into our workflow? What's the advantage there? And then, how can I engage all of my patients if this is the right thing to use? And then, lastly, I have a feeling there are a lot of apps out there. How can I, what I call discern the signal from the noise, right? How can I get just the data that I need to take care of that patient and not use that ream of paper that's been brought in? So with that, it had me think of, what I consider 5 insights as we think about navigating the world of mobile health data that I wanted to cover with you today. We'll talk about the problem of plenty, so the abundance of apps, how we can look at what the problems are that we're trying to solve instead of running straight to the solution. How do we get it out there and make it mainstream? What are some of the barriers and challenges there? Getting the right data to the clinician at the right point in time. And then how can we engage our patients in this effort? So for the first one here, the problem of plenty. So right now, there are over 320,000 healthcare apps in the App Store, right? Little crazy. And I've seen it quoted that there are approximately 200 added every week. So this is, a true definition of the wild, wild west, right? So they're just proliferating, and over 340 wearables on the market. And then to add to that, the environmental sensors, as we heard earlier, right? The sensors that we've got out there, both indoor and outdoor, collecting pollutant levels and all sorts of other environmentally generated data. So wow, so there's a lot out there. And how can we get through that? So one of the first pieces I wanted to draw your attention to, that right now, there is not an official certification process. And I think this is interesting because I hear from, folks around saying, oh yeah, this is a certified app. So just wanted to set the record straight. Right at this point in time, there is not. So that's kind of curious right there. However, we do have a piece of brightness in that the Federal Trade Commission is at least taking a look at apps from a business standpoint, and that if they are claiming to do something they cannot, at least, that's one way to put some constraint on it. So, but other than that, there isn't anything out there right now to certify a healthcare app. So I think that's important for us to know as we receive questions from either our colleagues or from patients. However, there are some interesting activities afoot. So these are 3 that I know of. I'm sure there are probably some others, but I thought these were worth mentioning. So the first one, Xertia, so they are a very new organization. So they are only about 3 or 4 months old. And they are looking at putting together policies and guidelines around healthcare apps. So maybe I would loosely refer to that as certification. So it won't be officially certifying, at least not yet. But how can they put some guidelines on how to answer patients' questions or help support clinicians on what app might be better than another? Actually, just last week, I'm happy to report that the Alliance of Nursing Informatics is now going to have a board seat for Xertia. So we will have a nursing voice at the table. So I think that's pretty exciting. So we'll have to keep an eye on that and see where that goes. The other two here are quite interesting. So Prescription Universe. So this product, what they do is take a look at different disease states, and they will basically aggregate apps that correspond with that disease state. So for instance, if you have diabetes, what they'll do is pool together the best, diabetic apps, right? Congestive heart failure, pool those together. Might not be exactly where we need to end up, but I think that's a start, trying to look at the different domains and see what's out there and how to pull those together. And then the last one, AppScript, which I personally think might have some promise. So this is actually if you think of it as a Yelp for healthcare apps. So what they are trying to do is aggregate recommendations from providers, recommendations from patients, and then they say they have their own secret sauce as well. So I'm not really sure what that is, but I'm guessing it's something on the analytics side of things, trying to understand who's using what apps and for what purposes. So they're giving apps a score, just to, again, from a Yelp perspective. So it's more of what the consumers are saying. It could be a completely, maybe a not well-created app, or it might not be serving the intended use, but it might be rated highly by users. So that's another interesting one to take a look at. So we do have concerns in this area, and I think as we hear about this, as getting that nursing voice in these areas, I think is going to be important as we move forward with these apps. And then the other piece in this area is speaking to the researchers out there. So there is very little evidence when it comes to healthcare apps, I think we have a couple examples of where we're seeing some movement. We heard earlier about the Nursing Big Data Conference. So we do have a work group there. If you're interested, would love to have you join us. So it's the mHealth work group. And we are starting to reach out to our fellow nurses and try to understand what's being used out there, what nurses are finding to be effective, what patients are using in terms of mHealth, so we can put some evidence that's research, that's scientific, and be able to share that amongst our colleagues. But these two pieces here, so digital biomarkers, so this is the first known publication that is indeed disseminating research on, it's everything digital, but it has a subset of mobile health. So they just put out their first issue in January. So if this is something of interest, I certainly would suggest checking that out. And then the other piece, Node Health, which I am intimately involved in, they started actually at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. So they are looking to move the science forward in this area. And we will have a nursing node that will be looking specifically at nursing-generated research around mobile health and digital health. So again, if this is of interest, these are some places to start. So we are starting to move, and hopefully we'll make some progress. So to sum up our problem of plenty here, so we've got a lot out there. It's a lot to sift through, so I think just that awareness and being able to, again, explain that to our colleagues and our patients. Anything we can do to build up that evidence. So if there's something working in your organization, even if it's in a blog post or a tweet, but let's get it out there. Let's share with each other what's working and what's not, for that matter. And then understanding the quality of the data. So then digging a bit deeper. So not just if patients are using it, but is it generating the data that's going to help us in our practice? All right, so the next insight I wanted to cover is falling in love with the problem and not the solution. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got 2% of patients using healthcare apps. However, I also mentioned that there are 320,000 apps out there, right? So there's clearly a disconnect. So what are patients looking for, and what needs do we need to be thinking about? I think one of the interesting pieces, at least in New York City, we have a program called the Digital Health Accelerator. And the idea is to encourage startups and vendors working in the healthcare app world. And I can't tell you how many of them I meet with that do not have a clinician at all on their team. So I think that also speaks volumes, right? So I think that's an area where not only can we get at the table of some of these larger organizations, but how can we maybe provide some consulting services to these startups and again bring that nursing voice to the development of these applications. So the most desired functions that patients are looking for, they want to be able to access data, they want to be able to do anything with their appointments, cancel, change, place their appointment, and they want data on prescriptions. So those are the top 3 things. And quite frankly, there are not a ton of apps that do that well. So I think there's clearly some opportunity there for those that are interested in moving this piece forward. And I just wanted to talk briefly about a project that I was involved in, and actually this is how I've become involved in mobile health data in general. So I was, in moving to the IT department after grad school, I was tasked with looking at patient-facing technologies, right? So what do we have that our patients are looking at? What can we learn? What are some of the usability issues? And then there was a piece around how do we operationalize patient-facing technologies. And one of the projects that I worked on was with a vendor called mHealth. So they're actually a pretty large company now. They originated in Korea. And they provide the National Diabetes Prevention Program via mobile app. So for those that might be familiar with it, it's in community centers and YMCAs, right? So patients that are pre-diabetics are encouraged to go to these in-person programs. And what they started to find out is that they had difficulty getting the patients to the community centers or to the YMCAs, much like the problem we have in getting patients to clinics at times, right? So these patients had to show up once a week to the community center and, get some teachings around prediabetes. They would get weighed, they had some other metrics taken, and they would have to do that for 16 weeks. So there was a real difficulty with compliance. So what Noom did is they said, let's see if we can put this into a mobile app and set the patients up with a health coach. So we gave that a try. So I implemented it in 5 of our clinics in the Washington Heights area of New York Presbyterian, and I was very fortunate to have the registered dietitian as my partner. So they would identify the pre-diabetics that would be good candidates for this, and I would then speak to the patients, consent them to be a part of this study, to get a free app. The patients were thrilled. They were very excited to be a part of this, which I was not expecting. I thought I'd get some pushback or some hesitation. But what we did was, and sorry, Data Dan, I might have to arm wrestle you on this later. So I do have a bar graph and I have a pie chart of both. I have both of them. Very good. So what we did was look at the patients over the course, and we actually had better engagement than is found with the traditional program. So we were very surprised by that. And I should mention one of the big pluses for the registered dietitians and why they became such great partners is that the patients were logging their meals. So for those of you that may be involved in this area, you know that the registered dietitians do all of that work at the beginning of the visit when they first see the patient in the clinic, right? They have them write down their meals for the last 3 days. So this was pretty big for them because they had the patients logging the meals on their own time. So then when they came in for their visit, the RDs had that data right there. So that was a big piece. But regardless, I think that this was pretty eye-opening for us, that we had patients that would be interested in collecting data, that we had partners with the dietitians who were more than willing to bring the patients on board and use those data. So just to give an example of how we can bring this into the clinical environment and find folks that are interested in using it. And then I just had to throw this in because this is also one of my favorites. But to sum up the idea of asking the right question, you just really want to make sure that what you're giving to the patient is something that's going to provide utility and value. And I don't think we see that in all of the apps that are out there today. So I know I'm standing between you all and lunch. So what I'm going to do here, we're going to take a slight pause, and I'm going to put a little, I'm going to have to escape here, huh? Here we go. A little bit of group work or individual work here. So I have some papers scattered about the seats, so I don't obviously have one for everyone. But what I wanted to do, if you'll indulge me, I haven't done it in this large of a group before, but what I have here is a handful of companies here. And I wonder if we could take about 5 minutes and kind of take a peek at some of these. I'm curious to see some of your thoughts around them. So what I've got here is, maybe just take one or two, take a look at the website, and if you don't have the capabilities, maybe get with a partner or two. And then I'd love to hear some of your impressions on what you like with the company, what it might be doing, if you think there's anything exciting about it, and then maybe we'll just get one or two responses. So a little, putting you to work here just a little bit. And don't feel like you need to download the app, so this is more just perusing the site. Which one? Yeah. Yeah, I forgot. I totally forgot to bring it. Oh gosh, I was going to bring it. Yeah, it's great. Okay, thank you. Thank you for taking a moment to give that a look. So any initial thoughts, comments? Anything you liked or didn't like? What's that? Was there a particular one that you thought? Gotcha. So just gives you the problems, but not necessarily guiding you to a solution. So great. Anything else? Yes.
We looked at a live core, and although it's great that you could, have an EKG, we didn't really know the average patient out there, their level of understanding of an EKG. One comment, a positive note on it was if somebody in a remote area who maybe is having some palpitations can utilize it and then send it to their physician versus going to the ED. But then we have Holter monitors for patients who are experiencing palpitations who would have that 24 hours continuously. So we thought it was great, but we're not sure if it's ready for
prime time?
prime time.
Awesome. Thank you, Joanne. Any other thoughts? Yes.
I looked at WellPass, and honestly, I couldn't still figure out what it needed it out. It was a lot of detail, and it had a section for the provider, for the insurance company, for the patient, and I got lost, and I was like, I don't know if this is even up.
Excellent. Thank you. So took a look at it and didn't even really know what it was about and how it could be helpful. Really good point. Yes?
I looked at WellSheet, and as far as provider, it gave like a dashboard for a patient, and it had several metrics over time, like their A1C and their blood glucose and what medications they were taking, and I thought it was very helpful, like on a snapshot, because, and it also reported like the data points against when they came in for encounters. So if they had high data points, they were in red, and then you could see that the patient was coming in for an encounter, like the patient was recognizing, some of the behaviors that would lead them to call the doctor. So
Great.
that was,
So you like some of the visuals and the fact that the patient got some of their data,
yeah,
but no bar charts?
no bar.
No bar charts. Yes.
I looked at a live core. I love a live core. I was at the Cheesecake Factory with a friend of mine 2 years ago, and she pulled out her phone, and I'm like, what are you doing? She goes, I have some palpitation. And she was able to get a single lead EKG, and what's cool about it is that her cardiologist gave it to her. So she was able to send it back to someone who was able to read it and store it. And I'm an old CCU nurse, so I knew all these 48-hour Holter monitors that you never can get the rhythm. Here, you can have it whenever you want. And then I was telling my brother at the beach, he got one for his wife because she has one. I just mentioned to Ann, she sent it to her friend. So it's like, if you could at least, even if you don't have a medical grade, you can see if something's irregular and needs to be followed up, and you can capture it. I think it's the coolest thing going.
Yeah.
And it's $99.
Certainly been in the news lately, that's for sure. Yes, thank you.
I also looked at WellPass, and before I even went through the website, I watched a video, which then just gave me an overview of what they were trying to do, and it was really a patient and, I think, a provider or, health plan or whoever can have that, I think, relationship, which I think we all try to strive for within our organizations, how to engage the patient. So, and then I started going through the website, and the website was definitely overwhelming.
Overwhelming. Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you for taking a moment to take a look at these. I should have mentioned I don't have an affiliation with any of these companies, aside from having an Alive Core myself. But the reason why I picked this group is because these are, deemed the best of breed at the moment. Right? So these are apparently some of the best. And I think, as some of you might have noticed or started to get the feel of, that there's not great education on them, right? And you might not know exactly what they're for up front. And who might be the ones to educate the patient and the families when they have questions, right? So I think it's just interesting to think about and just to be aware of the landscape. Again, there are, thousands and thousands more like these. But these are the ones that, that are out in front at the moment. A couple of them, especially the medication ones, Welshi, Care Evolution, so they actually are being used by the ONC, the Office of the National Coordinator, for their MedRec initiative that they started last year. So they're actually starting to work with some of the healthcare apps and help influence their direction. And then a couple of the other ones, especially AliveCore, are working with Apple. So they're getting some good intel there. So you can keep an eye out for these. I think it'll be interesting to see where they go or how they develop, and if there are others that start to seep in there as well. But I think as you can see that having that nursing influence and the clinical know-how of what the patients need or what the patients don't need, and how we can support that. So again, to sum up this idea of knowing what the problem is that we do need to think about what the patients want and making sure we're collecting data that we can provide back to the patient, using our care, and also considering the outcomes. Is the app doing what we want it to do? So the third one here, making it mainstream. I think this is our bread and butter, and in fact, in talking with Dan at dinner last night, he was talking about the fact that our implementation work is not done. Maybe the EHR implementation work is done, but we have many more other things to think about in terms of implementation. And I think this is one of them. I think thinking about how we're deploying patient-facing technologies and connecting with the patients in a lastable way. So not just kind of throwing them out there, but really having a plan on how your organization is going to engage with patients around these apps. And how you're going to answer questions. I think from the data perspective, we need to examine the workflows and practices. Can we fit another thing into discharge education? I don't know, right? So where does this fit into the workflow? And how can we do that? And then fitting to the existing architecture, although I think this is important, I think the technology, believe it or not, is the easy part. I think it's that operationalizing, answering questions, working with the patients and families. I think that's the tough part. And I think that's where, as informaticists, we can certainly make an impact. So one of the areas that I noted as I was doing some of our work at New York Presbyterian were issues around the clinician preparedness. Like, are the clinicians, are the registered dietitians, the nurses, whomever might be working with the patient, the front desk staff, do they have the support and training that they need to answer questions? So I was very curious about this, so I did a study to actually look at this. So with the help of some folks at the Alliance for Nursing Informatics, created a tool to look at the nurses' perception of their level of readiness to help patients and families with health IT tools. So I was just really interested, do the frontline nurses feel prepared? So with my findings, just real briefly here, and publication actually is under review, so hopefully it'll be out soon. From my findings, they did have an understanding of the goals. So the nurse was like, yep, I got it. I understand why we want to use health IT tools. However, also found this lack of confidence in answering questions from the patients and families. And that was the lowest scoring question there. So I'm confident that I can answer patient and family questions regarding the use of specific health IT tools, such as personal health records. And I also had a further explanation of any other health IT tools, apps, et cetera. So I think that's an interesting point for us to take home, is that we do need to bring our nursing staff into this conversation and making sure we incorporate it into training, whether it's our hospital doesn't have policies around this right now, or our hospital policy is we're not using mobile health data right now. So I think just making sure that our staff nurses, understand where we are. And then I think as we develop this further, how we can include it in our education for nurses. So to sum up number 3 here, so I think, again, using the implementation science that we know so well from EHRs and how can we apply it to another area. Identifying valuable use cases, again, finding those places where we are solving the problem and we do have the right solution and how can we share that. And have our nurses get engaged with the developers and the startups that are coming knocking on our doors, right? Let's get the nurses at the table there. And then how can we incorporate this into our nurse training? I think there's a real opportunity there. The next one here, I won't go too into this since I think Dan did a nice job with the data analytics piece. So I think, again, just realizing, we're throwing a lot of data at our nurses, right? And how can we make sure we're getting the data that they need? How can we summarize it properly and really just get those points to them that are going to make the difference? So looking at some of the patterns in the data and incorporating some of that contextual awareness. And I'll just touch briefly on this story here because I think it is a great example of how they looked at specific blood pressure values to pass along. So this is from UC Davis. They actually, don't know it off the top of my head, they actually received an award for this work. So they called it the Better Blood Pressure Initiative. But what they did was actually using Apple Health Kit, and they gave the patients blood pressure devices to take home and to take their blood pressure on regular intervals. And then what they did was pull those data back into the EHR. They didn't go into the personal health record. They didn't go into some separate PDF. It didn't go into some separate screen, right? It came right into the record for the clinicians. And they only showed the values that were out of range for that particular patient. So they didn't show every single value. So I think this was a really nice example of thinking about how to get the clinicians exactly what they needed. And they really made a point in their write-up that they involved the clinicians at every step of the way. And they said that, the technology wasn't the hard part, the patient engagement wasn't the hard part. The hardest part was getting the clinicians to trust the data that were coming in. So I thought that was super interesting. Like, how can we make sure that the clinicians trust the data and get the quality data that they need to make the decisions? So an interesting use case there. So again, getting those innovations that get the providers and the nurses the data that they need when they need it. How can we get some of those data points directly into the nursing assessment? Again, I think that would be amazing. What are some of the trade-offs that need to be considered? Talking with the clinicians and saying, we're not giving you extra data, but it's in place of this. So I think we need to have more of those conversations. And again, drilling down to the data that matter. Don't just start sending every piece of patient-generated data to the clinicians. And the last point that I wanted to cover here, and I think this is I think where nurses excel, is engaging with empathy. So how can we have those conversations with our patients and families about the technology? I think a lot of times we leave it out of the conversation, and we are now getting to the point where it does need to be a part of that conversation. So self-managing with chronic disease, lifestyle adjustment, health promotion. And I think what also is important for nurses is, understanding the readiness of the patients and families as well. A lot of times, they're not ready to engage with technology, and I think being able to recognize that instead of forcing it on patients and families is key. I also think the stage of the patients and families in the process with each disease is curious as well. So there's some work going on at Duke Health Systems. So what they are looking at is where patients, let's use diabetes as an example. So they've had diabetes, for 15 years. However, they just got their diagnosis with lung cancer last week. So they might be ready for an app to work on their diabetes, but you know what, right now they haven't accepted the lung cancer yet, and they're just not at the right stage. So I think discerning some of those specifics is where that special nursing talent comes into play. I don't think this is shared enough, so I love this, and I love talking about it at our organization. The patients and families really do trust what nurses have to say. So I think being well-versed in this area and being able to help guide patients and families through the process of these new technologies is super important. What I wanted to do here is just give you a short quote. Judy Murphy, who is one of the luminaries in our nursing informatics field, actually did an interview in October, just this past fall. And one of the quotes here I think is super appropriate for this insight that I wanted to share with you here. So she says, fast forward to today into the world of digital reinvention, and we're seeing patients take control of their own health, becoming an integral part of decision-making and a critical component of their own care teams. As a result, we're starting to truly understand the power of the patient in the digital world, exerting a participatory role of how we can leverage this engagement to improve patient outcomes. Nurses can support this active participation of individuals in their own health, and as nurses have literally led the way as patient advocates. Uniquely, nurses have consistently been ranked as one of the most trusted professionals and have so far for decades. This means that patients trust their opinion. So if a nurse offers a suggestion, patients are most likely to listen. So I think this really ties into how we can encourage this true patient-centered care. And we can use technology as a tool, not as an adversary, and really pull our patients into the conversation with that. And another piece that I also wanted to touch upon, pretty much the same time frame. So this was actually in November of 2017 in the Wall Street Journal. So there was a piece on the hype of virtual medicine. So it was a bit of a critique by Zeke Emanuel, but there were a few points related to nursing. So I'll quote, "The only interventions that seem to change the behavior of patients in a lasting way might be financial incentives. However, the long-term face-to-face relationships with nurses and healthcare coordinators, decidedly not high-tech, but are high-touch, they remain the most effective prescriptions to treat chronic illness." So again, that whole idea that as nurses, we really need to make ourselves known in that conversation and engage the patients with that technology. And it's not just technology alone. I think that's really the important point there. So to tie up here, so again, real opportunity to empower patients and engage in new ways. Again, pulling technology and that nursing, secret sauce together. And work to increase the awareness and usability of mHealth, understand what our patients and families want to use it for, and how we can support that. So where do we go from here? So I think it's going to get even more pervasive. So you've heard a little bit about AI and machine learning, but I think in terms of mobile health apps, I think we're going to see more and more gamification. These benefit and reward structures within healthcare apps in regards to behaviors and outcomes. So I think that's going to be really interesting. That's just starting. To see how that moves forward is going to be curious. I talked about this earlier. The power of social networks is also really, really curious. And there's some interesting research around diabetes that if you look at online communities of diabetics, they are producing better outcomes than diabetics alone, right? So not unusual to think about there. But again, just tipping our toe in the water there. Biometrics, so one of my favorites, the fact that I can measure my sweat rate in real time, or using one of the eye glucose monitors, like some really neat technologies. And what can we do with these data? Pretty amazing. And whoops, a little cut off there, the environmental sensors, as we talked about. I think the work going on with asthma, there's some great work with pediatric asthma and the indoor and outdoor sensors. Pretty amazing to think about. So to sum up those points we talked about, the abundance, building up the evidence, understanding the problem, and how nursing can be of huge value. And then just 3 quick takeaways to sum up here. So I think, again, starting those conversations, talk to the nurses. I think they already know what patients and families are using. So let's find out what's going on there and how we can move that forward. I think understanding your policies and procedures, that's one of the first things that I talk to nurses about when they ask me, what can I do with mHealth data? So understanding what they are, and if they're not there, maybe start to help create some of those policies around where they should be using mHealth data or where maybe it's not appropriate. Of course, include compliance and legal there, but working together as a team to figure that out. And to get involved with pilots. They are out there. So figuring out where they are and how we can share amongst our nursing colleagues. So with that, and I think Anne talked about this one as well, but this is one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Nash in Philly. So 80% of a population's well-being, its quality of life, is due to factors other than medical care, right? So, there's a lot of data that's not happening in our healthcare environment that we need to harness and figure out how to use to take better care of our patients. So with that, thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.